This is Gemara in Gittin Daf Mem, and we're holding on Lametesa Mebeis, knee deep in the sugya of Avadim. And we continue this lengthy sugya, 2 lines from the bottom, Lametesa Mebeis, in which the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Zera, the last line, Amar Rav Chanina, Amar Rav Ashi, Amar Rebbe. Eved shenasa esbas chayrin b'fnei rabbi. An Eved marries a bas chayrin, marries a free woman, lifnei rabbi, in front of his master. So we transition from the Eved who was makdish in the previous year, the Eved who was mafkir, and now we have a case in which an Eved marries a regular bas chayrin, not an amasa, not an Eved. The Eved marries a regular free woman, bifnei rabbi, a critical ingredient. Says the Gemara, what's the din? And this is, of course, why this is existing. This Gemara is over here. Says the Gemara, Yatza lechiris. The act of marriage, the act that the master saw, that he got married to a bas chayrin, shows that he must have been previously freed by the master. As the top Rashi points out, if not for the fact that the master had freed him, he would not have allowed her to mass a bas chayrin. So Amr Lacha, Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan responds to Rav Zera, Kol kach yesh biyadcha. So much? Really? This is such a chiddush. As Rashi points out, Mishmei the Rebbe, V'anei sheinachal meina mikudeshes. What do you mean? V'ani sheina kasov. Says Rav Yochanan, you know what I learned? I have a brisa that says if someone writes a shtar irusin to their shivcha, Ramei Roimer Mikudeshes, like you just said. But the Chachamim Oimrim Einoi Mikudeshes. The Chachamim hold that it doesn't work. So you're telling me that even witnessing a marriage is enough, but I have a brisa that the Chachamim say, even if the master himself is the one that writes, Harei Mikudeshes, it doesn't work. Einoi Mikudeshes. So says the Gemara, if in this case, we don't assume when the master himself is doing it, that he's freed, certainly not in your case. Answers the Gemara, 4 lines on the top. Kedamar Rabba Rav Shila, Kisha Rabbi Hiniach Lo Yitfilin. Explains the Gemara. Now, when do we say that it's Yatzel Cheiros? Not only if he witnessed a Kedushin, but if the master gives him Tfilin. That's the scenario. The master himself showing this evidence free. So Hachanami in our case as well, Kisha Rabbi Hisia Ishtoi. The master himself married him off to this woman. That's when we could assume that this person actually freed the Eved. So the Gemara is explaining that the Nikudas HaChilik, that the difference is, to the master, was it an active involvement or a passive involvement? Originally we thought it was a passive involvement, that the master saw a wedding happening in front of him, and the master didn't protest. So that shows that the master is allowing the Eved to act as a free man. Must be that the Eved is indeed a free man. But that is a stira to the Chachamim, because the Chachamim said that even if he writes Ishtar Irisin to his Eved, it doesn't work. So explains the Gemara, the difference is not just that he allows him to do it, but he himself actually goes and marries off the Eved. He's the one that arranged the marriage between the Eved and the free woman. That's the case Rebbe says is going to work. Now I just want to point out one extra detail that we might have glossed over, that in the top line, in the case of the Chachamim, was that Concise shtar irisin l'shivchasai was to himself, that the master writes that he is trying to marry the Eved. There, the Chachamim say it doesn't work because that doesn't show anything. Whereas in our case, it's maybe a bit counterintuitive, but in our case, if the master is arranging a marriage between this Eved and a free woman, it must be that indeed the Eved was previously freed. So continues the Gemara and says, no, Omika midi, the point that we just pointed out that was counterintuitive. Mika miti dila avdei lo mevet leisura v'iu avdi isura. Is it possible that we would not help the slave do an isser, but he would help the slave, but he would do the isser himself? I don't understand. To say that the master himself would marry, that we said the Chachamim said in a mikudeshes. But we're saying that he would go and free the Eved and allow him to get married? How could that be? So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachar Yitzchak, we're talking about over here, Amar Lei, Tzei boy, Viskadshi boy. The case is where the master said, go out with this document, Viskadashti boy, and be married to me with it. That's the case that Rameir and the Chachamim, 3 lines on the top, argue. Meaning, we're changing and we're saying really it's true. If the master wed him off, if the master is intimately involved in the marriage, the Eved is indeed married. So why in the prior case, when the master tried to marry the Eved for themselves, the Shivcha for herself, we said it doesn't work? So says the Gemara, because that's a unique case. It's where he gave her a shtar, and he said, this shtar you should be freed with, and this shtar as well should act as your kiddushin. So Rameir holds that within the words that he said, we see that he freed him, so he can be married to her. Mekudeshes. V'Rabbanan Zavri, no, in blush as elosh shechur. So this machlekes, there's no bearing on our machlekes. It's a separate machlekes whether there's a lashon of shechur in that which he said. Continues the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon Levi Avecheniach Tefillin Bifnei Rabbi, a similar case. The Evan puts on tefillin in front of his master. Yatzal Lecheir, says Rabbi Shimon Levi. Meisvei asks the Gemara, Lava Imenu Rabbi. The Brisa says that if the master borrowed money from him, the master made from him an appointee for his property. That's our case. He reads 3 psukim in shul. So the Brisa clearly says that putting on tefillin in front of the master is not enough of an act to assume that he's actually a free man. Explains the Gemara, about 20 lines down. First word line is Shila Rabbi Yiniach Loi Tefillin. Again, the same nuance that we said before. It's not just that the Eved puts on tefillin himself, that the master was intimately involved. He gave him the tefillin. Continues the Gemara, Ki Adar Rav Dimi Amar Rav Yechon, like Rav Dimi said the name Rav Yechon. Mishamar Vishas Misasai Ploinish Evchasi Al Yishtab Diba. If someone says that on his deathbed, Pliny, my servant Eved, don't make her work after my death. What is the status of such a statement? Says the Gemara, Kaifin es Yarshim, we forced the Yarshim to indeed free this woman. But continues the Gemara that this din of Rav Dimi is not conclusive. Amr Rav Ami, Rav Asi, Rebbe, Yata Moidish Avadim. Do you not admit that the children are slaves? Why do we force the Yarshim to free this Eved? They shouldn't have to, argues Rav Ami and Rav Asi. So says the Gemara, Ki Asar Rav Shmuel Bar Yudam Rav Yechon, a slight different nuance. This Eved, she was very nice to me. So be nice to her also. And so that's the case that we force the Yarshim to do Kairas Ruach, to be nice to Eved. Why? My time, and this is where we see the fine nuance of difference. Because mitzvah lakayim divrei hameis. Because it's a special mitzvah to listen to the words of the mace. And if the mace said that this Eved was nice to me, and therefore I want you to be nice to her, therefore we should honor his wishes. His wishes. Continues Ameimar, first cousin to dinner we saw yesterday. So it is Mafkir is Eved. That Eved, there's nothing you could do to him, for him. Why not? My taima gufay lekani lei. His body is not acquired to him, and he's true. But there is still an iser that he's still at some level owned by the master. And that part he can't give away. So by going and being mafker is Eved, yesterday we saw they said the name of Rav Yechanan that the Eved goes free through such a statement. Over here, Amemra argues, and Amemra says you completely messed the Eved up, because once you're mafkia, once you remove your power of mammonis, of monetary control over the Eved, all you have left is the Isser that he's an Eved. There's no way to dissolve that. But Rav Ashi comes along and he says, what do you mean? But we saw previously yesterday that in both cases, the case of Makdish Avdai, the case of Mafkir Avdai, the din was Yatzel Lecheirus. You just need to get Shechur. So Amar Lei Sarich Vein L'Taikana. Amir says, I agree. Sarich get Shechur, but Ein L'Taikana, there's no way to write that Shechur because the master has no longer any monetary ownership of the Eved. Ikadiyami, another way of learning that which we just said. Amar Amemar Mafkir Avdai Umeis. Oh, so Evan in the Takana, if he dies, then the Evan has no Takana. My time, what's the reason? And the child doesn't inherit the Isser portion, the ownership of the Evan. And on this, they said that Rav Dimi is a mistake. So, excuse me, no, incorrect. Rav Dimi Amar Rav Yechanan. Ask the Gemara, what about the statement of Rav Dimi, name of Rav Yechanan, that Hamafker Avdai Yatzel Acheiros Pafik Sarach Get Shechur? So why are you telling me that there's nothing to do? Says the Gemara, Rav Dimi Ta'usa, either Rav Dimi is a mistake. Amrlei Rav Ashi says, what do you mean by Ta'usa? What's the mistake? Talamar Blashat Shechur, Hamar Blashat Shechur Achanami, was the mistake that the master didn't say Blashat Shechur, but if he did, it would work. Amrlei, no, because Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda severely. I hold like Rav Shua Bar Yehuda, the way that he learned Rav Yechanan, and therefore that's not going to be a steer to that which I said. So two different ways of learning this din of Rav Dimi. And now that we're on the topic of freeing Avadim, and continues the Gemara with a story. 3 lines from the white lines. Ahu disik rasa ta'avdi. There was a certain area owned by Avadim. The izdabin la'akum, and the area, the whole neighborhood was sold to Goyim. Kalu maravasa basrai. So what happens? The Goyim left eventually, and there was nothing left. So we have this area which is just avadim, and there's no one to inherit it. So Aslik made Ravina Amar Le Zilu Ahadru Abane Maravasa Kamai. Says Ravina, you know who's the owner? You go back to your first master. Meaning these avadim, who now owns these avadim? Originally, I owned an Eved. Then that area was bought by Goyim. Now the Goyim abandoned ship. So who owns that Eved? Says Ravina, goes back to the original master. And the original master should free the Eved. So Amrli Rabbanan, the Rabbanan said to Ravina, what do you mean? How can you say that? No. So this should be the same thing. When the Goyim died, we should have the same situation. That there's nothing to do with these avadim because no one owns the portion of Isser in them. Amr leho, the same answer. No, Kravdim is fearly. Amr le Kravdim teusi. Amr le mai teusa. Amr la shechra. Amr la shechra chanami. But says the Gemara ve'achza kiravina. Halach la ma'isa is that we do paskin like Ravina. We continue with another story. 4 lines from the bottom. So again, in this previous story, we are paskining like Ravina, that what? These avadim go back to the original masters, and the original master has to write them a get shechur. Says the Gemara, 4 lines from the bottom, Daf Mem and Aleph. There was an Eved who was owned by 2 different people. One of them got Avish Achre and freed him. Lepal gave half of the Eved. Amr Idach. Hashta now. Shama be Rabbanim. The Rabbanim going to hear that I only own an Eved in half. And I'm going to lose the Eved. So Azal Aknel b'nei Katan. So this person was a smart guy. And he said, you know what? I'm going to take the half that I own. I'm going to transfer ownership to my child who is a Katan. And such a child, the Rabbanan can force him to free him. Again, we just said we said yesterday that an Eved that's owned partially What's the din? As you see 2 lines into Rashi, from the end of Rashi, Rashi says, we forced the master to free the other half. So the second guy was upset. He didn't want to lose it, Evid. So he said, you know what? I'm going to give it to my son. And then the Chachamim won't be able to force him to free the Evid. Shachal Rav Yosef Breid the Rava. So Rav Yosef Breid the Rava sent the following story, like a made the Rav Papa. Shachal Rav Papa responds, Kashar Asa, Kain Yasa Lai. That which he did, do back to him. Gomulai Yashav Lai Baraishai. That which he was dishonest should be on his head. So what are we going to do? Anan Kim Milan be Anuka de Mekarvi Daitali Gabi Zuzi. We know that what is a child like? Shiny coins. So Mukmin Allah Apotropis. Therefore, we're going to give the child an Apotropis. We're going to give a Bezdin appointee to be in control of the estate of the child. And then what? Umekarkishile Zuzi. As we turn over to Mem Amid Beis. And what we're going to do is we're going to shake some coins before the child. And the child is going to hear and going to be enticed by the wonderful money. And what's the child going to want to do? The child's going to say, free this Evet. But the child can't free the Evet. But we already appointed him an Apotropis. The Apotropis can free the Evet. Because like Gittin the Cherus al Shemei, and the Apotropis, the Bezdin appointee, will write a get chisr, get shechrer on behalf of the child. So the Gemara rules, interestingly, just because this guy acted in a crude way, a bit of a dishonest way, trying to give it away to prevent Bezdin from enforcing their dinim, will find a way to still enforce the din. Says the Gemara 2 lines down, Mem Beis Taner Rabbanan, Haimer Asisi Plani Avdi ben Chayrin, Asui ben Chayrin. If he says Arehu ben Chayrin, Arehu ben Chayrin, Asenu ben Chayrin, let's say he said, I have in the past freed this Eved. Rabbi Yomer Kana, that indeed works. Chamer like Kana, Rabbi Yechanan, V'kulam Bishar. All these statements would only work if it was written in a document. Continues the Gemara 7 lines down, the 2 dots. A very similar case. We just say cases, different lishonis, different terminologies. How and whether the evidence is free. It says the Gemara, if someone says, I'm giving this field to a certain person, as soon as it's given. If he says this field is his, belongs to that person. But what happens at Tanenu LePlaini? What if he says, I will give it to Plaini? Again, I think I said that wrong a moment ago. Yes, I said it, when I read Asenu ben Chayrin, I said I did, not that I did. I will make him a ben Chayrin. That's the question. So too over here at Tanenu LePlaini, I will give this field to so and so. What is the din? Ramei Raimer Kana, V'chamayrim Loikana, Rav Yechanan V'kulan B'shtar. Tanu Rabbanon, Haimer Azizi Plani Avdi ben Chayrin. I made my Eved ben Chayrin. V'omer lo yasani. The Eved says, no, it's not true. He never freed me. Chayshina and Shemazis Chalaya de'acher. Maybe he didn't know. How could he have done that? He could be Mzoicha. He could have a third party acquire the get shikra on his behalf. So Shemazis Chalaya de'acher. And therefore, the Eved is indeed freed. Another case. If the guy says, I wrote a shtar shechur and I gave it to the Eved, the Eved says it never happened, says the Gemara, Idas Baldin, Kemeya Edim Dami. The admittance of a Baldin, and therefore we believe the Eved said he never got it, he is the Baldin over here, therefore the Eved is indeed self-freed. And we continue in the same vein. If someone says, I have given over such a field to someone, you didn't give it to me. If he says, I wrote and I handed it to him, no, he didn't. We conclude this portion. The Gemara is saying, Mi oichel peiros. In this final field, who is the one that eats the produce? Meaning, we said that he does Baldin and it's not his field, so who gets the rights to the field right now? Rav Chisda Amar, no, the guy who gave it. Rabba Amar, no. The Maisa is a Shaila, says Rabba. So Mishalshin is a Peiros, we have to give the Peiros over to a third party and it has to sit there until we figure out what's going on. And as Rashi says, it's going to take hopefully not too long to figure out what's going on. But this is a situation, says Rashi, of what does it mean that we give it to a third party? It means Ache Yavoi Eliyahu Hanavi. We have to wait for Eliyahu Hanavi. And says the Gemara of Eloi Pligi, but indeed, Rabba and Rav Chisda don't argue. Ha be'abba, ha be'asra. Rav Chisda is talking about the person himself, and such a person is believed. Habibra. Whereas Rav Abba is referring to the son of the person, not the recipient himself. Therefore, he doesn't have the same level of credibility. And we begin the next Mishnah before we call it a day. Eved shall say Rabbi Apatiki. If we have an Eved that the master makes him an Apatiki, we'll explain what that means in a moment. Le'achirim, for one of his Baal Chayivs, and then V'shechoroi, and then he frees him. Shuras Adin, Shuras Adin means by the letter of the law. Ein Eved Chayiv Klum. Al may take an Oilam, but we make a Taikana de Rabbanan that Kovin et Shav Osas Ben Chayim the Koisiv Shtar Al Damav Yes to free him and write a Shtar. Rashbag Oimer, no. Einoi Koisiv Ella Mishachror. You don't have to write anything, says Rashbag, but rather the one who freed him has to write it. So let's go into Rashi very quickly. This is really going to be the sugya that we're going to pick up with tomorrow. It says Rashi, what is Apatiki? What does it mean he made the evidence Apatiki? Tiki. Aim loy efar elacha. Someone says to a creditor, I owe someone $100. He says, where's my money? And I tell him at the time of the halva, if I don't pay you, if I don't give you the money, it stands for apoitei kai. This should be there, meaning this evid right here. This is where you're going to get payment from. And then, unfortunately, after he said he could get payment from the evid, he went and he was mishachrer the evid. So what's the halacha? The letter of the law is the Eved has no obligations. He was freed and everything is good and dandy. But when they take an Oilam, we force the master to make the Eved free. And then the Eved writes a shtar on his own value because he's really owned by this other guy. Whereas the Shpag says you don't have to. And we're going to pick it up from this detail in the next year. Mirza Hashem.